a girl of just 5 years old, spoke daily to someone no one else could see. They weren't just random phrases or passing jokes. They were long conversations, full of details, laughter, confidences, as if you were in front of a flesh and blood friend. But there was something intriguing. She described this friend with precision. His gaze, his voice, even stories from a past she could never know. At first, his parents believed it was just a child's imagination, but as the days passed, they realized there was something much bigger going on. Words of comfort, messages of wisdom, memories of people who were no longer among the living. Where could such a small child get all that from? Could it just be the fertile mind of a dreamy girl? Or the silent proof that the spirit world is much closer than we dare believe? It was a simple family. No luxuries, no excesses. They lived in a small house, with walls already marked by time, but where love overflowed in every corner. Faith. There was discreet but sincere. A prayer before bed, a glance at the sky on silent nights, and the certainty that God always guided their steps. In the middle of this simple home, there was Clara. The girl was only 5 years old, but she already had a different sparkle in her eyes. She was light, cheerful, and full of life. She loved playing in the yard, running barefoot through the wet grass after the rain, feeling the wind blow on her face as she laughed out loud, that free-flowing laugh only children can give. Her innocence was enchanting. The neighbors always commented, "This girl has a special light," and indeed it did. But there was something about Clara that set her apart from other children her age. While her friends made up stories with dolls or talked about princesses, Clara had constant company. A friend that no one else could see. She called him Pedro. He described him as a slightly older boy with a serene look and a kind smile. She said he played with her, talked at length, and often even gave her advice. At first, his parents thought it was funny. "It's just a child's imagination," they said to each other, smiling. They believed it was just a phase, like so many others. But little by little, something began to change. Clara's conversations with Pedro became more profound. It was no longer just laughter or pretend play. They were dialogues full of feelings, teachings, and revelations. Clara spoke as if she were in front of someone real. He paused to listen. He responded attentively, as if there were, in fact, another voice filling that silence. One night, while helping her daughter put away her toys, the mother heard Clara say, "Pedro told me that I shouldn't be afraid of the dark, because God's light always protects me." The mother shuddered. I had never said that to the girl. Where could she have gotten such words from? Over time, Clara began to reveal secrets she had no way of knowing. Old family stories, memories of people who had already passed away. One day, looking at a picture frame hanging on the wall, Clara stopped. He pointed to the photo and said in a sweet voice, "Mommy, Pedro said that this is his grandfather, and that he is fine now, in heaven." The mother let her heart race. The photo was of his father, a man Clara never knew, because he had left years before she was born. At that moment, the laughter that Clara's parents had previously given her at her conversations turned into silence and unease. It was no longer possible to ignore. There was something going on, something that went beyond the barrier of children's imagination. And little by little, that simple home began to be enveloped by an ever-deepening mystery. The nights became different. While her father watched television in the living room and her mother tidied the kitchen, Clara, in her room, spoke quietly to Pedro. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he seemed to listen seriously. There were times when her eyes would fill with tears, as if she understood something no child her age should understand. The parents, restless, began to observe, and the more they observed, the more doubts arose. Who was Peter, a fruit of the daughter's fertile imagination, or someone who was really there, even if invisible to the common eye? The answers were still unclear, but one thing they could no longer deny. Clara's conversations were changing not only her childhood, but the lives of everyone around her. And what seemed like just an innocent child's game would soon reveal itself as a powerful sign that the spiritual world was much closer than they could imagine. And it is precisely from that moment that the story begins to take an unexpected turn, a path where faith, mystery, and emotion intertwine. And what you're about to hear next may forever change the way you look at those invisible voices children often hear. One night, as the wind gently blew against the window and silence filled the house, Clara said something that chilled her mother's heart. In a calm voice, almost as if repeating a lesson she had just learned, the girl murmured, "Pedro told me that I shouldn't be afraid of the dark, because God's light always protects me." The mother stopped, feeling her whole body shudder. He had never said that to his daughter. I had never used those words before. And yet, there was Clara, conveying a message of faith and comfort that didn't seem to fit in the mind of a child of just 5 years old. At that moment, the mother didn't know what to say. He just stood there in silence, watching his daughter play as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But inside her, something broke. The easy explanation that it was all just a child's imagination was beginning to crumble, and the following days only increased the uneasiness, because Clara started revealing things that she absolutely couldn't know. He spoke of old family stories, details of events that had never been told to her, names, places, memories of people long gone. Sometimes he would say, "Pedro told me that Grandma liked to sing to the birds, but the girl never met her grandmother." And yet, she described scenes that her mother remembered clearly, like that morning when her grandmother stood in the yard, in a simple apron, whistling old tunes as she tossed breadcrumbs to the birds. Each sentence Clara said was like an arrow piercing her parents' reason. There was no denying it. She had access to memories that weren't hers. Until one ordinary afternoon, when the sun illuminated the living room, Clara did something that marked the life of that family forever. While playing, he stopped in front of the wall where there was a framed photograph. He was silent for a few seconds, staring at the portrait. Then, in a calm voice, he pointed and said, "Mommy, Pedro said that this is his grandfather, and that he is fine now, in heaven." The mother felt her legs weaken. The picture frame almost slipped from her trembling hands. It was a picture of his father, a kind man who had left years before Clara was born. The girl couldn't recognize him. She had never seen him before. The tears came uncontrollably. How to explain? How could she believe that her daughter, just 5 years old, was saying those words without there being anything more than imagination? At that moment, everything around seemed in suspense. The mother's heart was beating fast. Her teary eyes were searching for some logic, but the only real sensation was that there was a greater presence there, invisible, but very much alive. The following days were a mixture of fear and fascination. Fear of not understanding what was happening, and fascination in realizing that Clara, in some way, was the bearer of something great. The father, more skeptical, tried to ignore it. He said they were coincidences, random phrases, figments of the imagination. But even he, little by little, began to waver. One time, he heard Clara talking to herself in her room. Curious, he approached without making a sound, and he heard his daughter say in a serious tone, "Yes, Pedro, I'll tell them you're okay. They don't need to cry anymore." The man stopped in the doorway, goosebumps rising from head to toe. It was impossible not to feel that those words carried real weight, as if they came from a heart that knew the pain of longing, but also the certainty of reunion. Conversations became part of the routine. During the day, Clara seemed like an ordinary child. She ran, played, laughed. But at night, he would delve into conversations that intrigued and moved his parents. Sometimes he talked about things in the present. Other times, he mentioned events from long ago, and at certain moments, she would let out phrases that seemed like advice, almost as if Pedro were an older brother, an invisible guide, someone who loved and protected her. That family's simple home began to carry an invisible weight. Each night seemed to open a new door to the unknown, and deep down, both mother and father knew that something inevitable was approaching. The mystery was just beginning, because, with each revelation, with each sentence from Clara, the certainty grew that Pedro was not just a figment of her imagination. But who was he, after all? A spirit linked to the family? A protector sent to protect the child? Or just the voice of a sensitive childhood, capable of capturing what adult eyes can no longer perceive? The answers had not yet arrived. But one thing was certain. The conversations with Pedro were about to lead that family to a moment of such profound revelation that would forever change the way they viewed life, death, and what lies beyond them. Parents began to observe more closely. There was no longer any laughter at Clara's conversations. Now, the girl's every word was accompanied by restless looks, racing hearts, and a constant feeling that something extraordinary was happening. The conversations always took place at night, in the silence of the room lit only by the soft moonlight that came in through the window. While the house rested, Clara talked, and talked a lot. They were complete dialogues, with pauses, responses, gestures, and expressions that left no doubt. She wasn't just making it up. It was as if there was actually someone by his side. At first, the parents tried to convince themselves that it was their imagination, but the more they listened, the harder it became to sustain this idea. The girl spoke of feelings, memories, pain, and consolation with a maturity that was beyond her 5 years of age. Until, one rainy morning, the mystery intensified. The mother woke to the sound of her daughter's soft voice. The wind blew hard against the window, and the sound of rain filled the room. But beneath that constant noise, there was a clear, steady voice that seemed to emerge from the girl's room. With light steps, the mother approached, leaned against the half-open door and remained silent. His rapid breathing betrayed his nervousness. And then, he clearly heard Clara say, "Yes, Pedro, I'll tell them you're okay. They don't need to cry anymore." The words entered that woman's heart like a bolt of lightning. It was impossible not to feel the strength within them. The mother put her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sob that insisted on escaping. The tears came immediately, hot, uncontrollable. At that moment, there was no more room for doubt. It wasn't just a childish game. Clara wasn't just talking to herself. She was a channel, a pure and innocent instrument through which a message from beyond reached the living. With teary eyes, the mother watched her daughter in silence. Clara smiled slightly, as if she heard a friendly and welcoming voice. There was tenderness in his face, a peace that contrasted with the storm outside. It was as if, inside that room, there was an invisible refuge where the pain of the world had no power. The mother's heart sank. Questions piled up. Who was Pedro anyway? Why had he chosen his daughter to convey that message? And most importantly, what would happen from then on? The following days only reinforced the mystery. More and more, Clara seemed connected to something that surpassed common understanding. He wasn't just a child's invisible friend, it was a bond that brought comfort, that carried messages of hope, and that awakened feelings in the parents that were a mix of fear and faith. The father, previously resistant, also began to surrender. One night, she approached the room with the intention of finally catching her daughter in some make-believe, but when I heard his calm, almost prayerful voice saying, "Pedro, I promise I'll take care of mommy and daddy when they cry," he couldn't take another step. He stood there, motionless, feeling a shiver run down his spine. The truth he most feared accepting was right in front of him. Clara was talking to someone real, and not just real, someone who carried love, care, and a mission. That family's home had been transformed. Before, it was just a simple house. Now, every corner seemed charged with mystery, with spirituality, with something invisible that, nevertheless, was deeply present. The mother, from time to time, found herself looking at her daughter in silence, trying to find some explanation in the childish expressions. But the more I searched, the more I realized that Clara didn't have all the answers. She herself seemed to just follow the voice that came from a place beyond life. And so, little by little, the parents began to understand that the story was just beginning, because every sentence spoken, every revelation made by Clara, seemed to pave the way for something even greater, a revelation that would transform not only that family, but also the way they viewed existence. The mother's heart knew Pedro was not just a childhood companion. It was a spirit with a mission, a purpose that would soon be revealed. But what purpose would that be? What did that invisible boy want to communicate through his daughter? And why had Clara been chosen? These questions remained suspended in the air, like echoes that found no answer, but the feeling was inevitable. Something great was about to happen. Long pause, soft suspense track intensifies because, just when the parents believed they had seen enough, life would show them that the true revelation was yet to come, and it would be at that moment that faith and mystery would intertwine in such an intense way that not even the most skeptical of hearts could remain indifferent. Not knowing what to do, overcome by doubt and the need to understand, the parents decided to seek help. It was no longer possible to ignore the events. Clara's conversations, the details she revealed, the serenity with which she conveyed messages that did not belong to her. All of this called for answers. After many conversations among themselves, they came to the conclusion that they needed to go to a spiritualist center in the city. The decision wasn't simple. The father still struggled with skepticism, while the mother desperately searched for an explanation that could bring peace to her heart. But the love for his daughter and the desire to protect her spoke louder. On the appointed night, they entered for the first time that simple, silent environment, perfumed by the scent of flowers and the welcome that could be felt right at the door. They were received with serenity. There were no judgments, there was no rush, just listening and understanding. The medium, a man with a calm gaze and a firm voice, listened to every detail of the story. He didn't interrupt at any time. He just nodded as if he had already understood from the beginning what was happening. When the story ended, silence filled the room. The distressed parents waited for an answer that could ease the burden they carried. It was then that the medium smiled with profound serenity and said, "Children have freer souls, less tied to the illusions of the world. Therefore, they often see and feel what we adults have forgotten how to perceive." The words penetrated deep into the mother's heart. It was as if they explained, in a few sentences, everything I was experiencing. Clara wasn't making things up. She wasn't crazy or lost in daydreams. She simply hadn't yet lost the purity and sensitivity that adulthood often erases. The medium continued, with a sweetness that calmed the worries, "Don't be afraid. Your daughter is not alone. She's just more sensitive, more receptive. And this Pedro she speaks of is someone who brings light, comfort, and care. He's not just any spirit. He's a friend, a protector, a bond of love that crossed death to remain with her." The mother's eyes filled with tears. The father, still disconcerted, could not find words. It was at that moment that the medium opened a book that was on the table, the Gospel according to Spiritism, and he read a sentence that seemed to have been written exactly for that moment. Childhood is the phase in which the spirit is most malleable and accessible to influences. It is the time in which it must receive impressions that can direct the future. A deep silence filled the room. Those words echoed within them like a bomb. The mother felt a heavy burden lift. The father, for the first time, saw the situation not as a danger, but as a gift. They finally understood that Clara was not at risk. On the contrary, she was supported by a spiritual presence that came to comfort, teach, and protect. Pedro was not a figment of the imagination. Pedro was living proof that the bonds of love are not broken by death. From that night on, fear gave way to faith. The parents began to look at Clara's conversations with reverence, and no longer with concern. They began to write down the messages the girl transmitted, saving every detail as if they were treasures sent from heaven. The house, once shrouded in doubt and unrest, was transformed into a place of peace. There were still unanswered questions, it's true, but now there was also trust. They knew they were not alone. They knew Peter was real and that his presence had a purpose. And deep down, a certainty began to dawn in the mother's heart. If the bonds of love survived death, then Peter was not just there by chance. He was part of that family, in a way they still couldn't understand. Long pause, soft soundtrack of emotion and hope in the background, but what would be Peter's mission? What still needed to be revealed through Clara? And how would this experience forever change not only that family, but also the way we see life and what lies beyond it? These answers were about to emerge. Clara grew up. Time, with its silent delicacy, transformed the girl with bright eyes into a young woman who carried an unusual serenity in her gestures and gaze. Conversations with Pedro, which were once almost daily, began to become rarer. Little by little, childhood gave way to responsibilities, discoveries, and the concerns of youth. But inside her, something never changed. The memory of that invisible friend who always brought him comfort, advice, and peace remained alive, kept like a precious secret. There was no need to talk about him all the time, because Pedro was now part of her essence. It was ingrained in his memory as a sacred chapter of his life, which could never be forgotten. His parents also carried this treasure in their hearts. They kept every detail, every word spoken, every teaching transmitted through their daughter. They didn't see those experiences as strange or scary, but as a blessing, a rare opportunity to understand that the spiritual world is not a distant fantasy, but a constant presence which accompanies us silently, even when we do not realize it. Those experiences transformed the way they viewed life, pain, longing, and even death itself. They discovered that childhood is a sacred portal, a time when the purity of the soul becomes a bridge to the invisible. It is during this period that hearts are open, free from the illusions and barriers that the adult world insists on raising. And maybe we've all been there. Perhaps you, who are listening to this story now, also had an invisible friend, a playmate, a gentle voice on nights of fear, a silent presence that made you feel protected, even without knowing how. Some grow up and forget, others prefer to ignore it, telling themselves it was all just imagination. But there are those who, by keeping these memories in their hearts, know that they were signs, small fragments of a greater love, of a spirituality that has always been there, by our side, just waiting for us to be ready to perceive it. Because, after all, death is not the end. She is just the beginning, a return to the true home, an awakening to a life even fuller and truer than we can imagine. Clara, as she grew up, understood that Pedro had not left. He had just become more subtle, more silent, and deep down, it was still there, following his steps, guiding his choices, protecting his path. The bond that united them had not been broken, because bonds of love are eternal. They just transform, cross dimensions, overcome time and distance. And it is this certainty that consoles, that strengthens, that enlightens. The certainty that no one leaves alone, that there is always someone visible or invisible who guides us, who loves us, and who proves to us that love is greater than any limit imposed by matter. Clara grew up, changed, matured, but she never stopped believing, and this faith, born from a unique childhood experience, became the foundation on which he built his entire life.